Okay, great. So in the interest of time, everyone, thank you so much for joining. I'm Andy Dwyer from the University of Colorado. I help direct a statewide program for implementation for colorectal cancer screening for the medically underserved. Have worked a lot with partners, including our state health department, COPIC, and others around capacity building as it relates to colorectal cancer screening, and have had the courtesy and privilege to work with Dr. Jones out of CU gastroenterology and the team in terms of really looking at the provider education components and building capacity. So we're excited to specifically talk about part of the work on the Western Slope. We are concentrating on the Western Slope this evening, given some of the initiatives that we have relative to building out capacity with some funding from the Centers for Disease Control and CDPHE. So we're going to do a primer in this session related to average risk population screening guidelines and modalities. We will be spending some time around medical management of those who are at increased or higher risk. And Dr. Jones will be joining us for both sessions. So Blake, I'll turn it over to you, and I'm happy to help run the slides this evening. So Dr. Jones, take it away.
Thanks, Andrea. So as Andrea mentioned, I'm Blake Jones. I'm an assistant professor in the Division of Gastroenterology and Hepatology at the University of Colorado. And you can advance the slides. No disclosures. All right. So what I have been tasked with talking about tonight, we're going to go through kind of a quick general background on colorectal cancer, because that's kind of what we're all here to talk about. I want to set the stage. We're going to look at screening both kind of nationally and then specifically how we're doing in Colorado and on the Western Slope. I do want to delve into the relatively recent updates to the guidelines, both in screening and then for surveillance, just because as primary care doctors, you often are tasked with following up on the recommendations of the GI doctors who perform the colonoscopy, so it's helpful to know why. And then we will talk about kind of comparing all the available colon cancer screening tests, as well as a little highlight of what might be on the horizon to look out for. You can advance. So background, want to keep going. All right, so these are projections for the this year, but so based on more recent years. In general, we know colon cancer, third most common cancer, second leading cause of death related to cancer in the United States and actually worldwide. Actually, among men younger than 50, it's the leading cause of cancer-related death. Your average risk patient has about a 4% lifetime risk of developing colorectal cancer, and that changes then based on family history, type of polyps, or whether or not they have polyps, things like that. Projections for this year, so about 152,000 incident cases of colorectal cancer in the United States, almost 20,000 of those in people under the age of 50, and then over 52,000 deaths. And 3,700 or so of those patients under the age of 50. The, I guess, good news, depending on how you look at it, is that over 50% of colorectal cancer cases are at least attributed somewhat to modifiable risk factors. So those are heavy alcohol use, tobacco use, sedentary lifestyle, obesity, and then poor diet, primarily low fiber diet or diet high in red meat. And then the overall incidence rate for colorectal cancer in the United States is 35.9 out of 100,000. And just using that as a benchmark so we can compare Colorado and then the Western Slope. You can advance. All right, so obviously the incidence is related to age, and so colorectal cancer is much more common as we get older. But we also know that the incidence of colorectal cancer over time has decreased. So that little graph kind of up in the top left compares incidence rates from 1975 to 1979 to 2015 and 2019. You can see overall they're significantly lower, but what I will point out is that in ages 50 and 51 and 52, the incidence rates are actually now higher in the most recent 5 years compared to those in the 1970s, which kind of points to this birth cohort effect, which I'm going to talk about a little bit more later in relation to why we moved up the recommended screening from 50 to 45. You can advance. And then other things just to highlight that many of us are probably aware of, so colon cancer more common in men, and then among races and ethnicities, American Indian and Alaskan Natives have the highest incidence rates and mortality. Next, non-Hispanic Blacks, and then kind of everyone else goes from there. And then both the sex and race discrepancies kind of persist across incidence and mortality. Okay, advance. All right, so what about Colorado? So the good news, Colorado has the third lowest incidence rate and the third lowest mortality rate among all states in the country. But Colorado is, divided between kind of the Front Range, which is more urban, and then obviously where you guys are from on the Western Slope, which is a lot more rural patients. And what we know kind of in general about rural patients is they're more likely to be uninsured, they're more likely to be underrepresented minorities, and therefore they're more likely to have a higher incidence rate in general and a higher risk of being diagnosed with late stage colon cancer. Advance. All right, so this just kind of shows first in the bottom there trends over time, and then kind of a state distribution of incidence rates for colon cancer. So this data from 2016 to 2020. Good news that over the last 2 decades, similar to what's been going on in the country at large, the incidence rates of colon cancer in Colorado have been decreasing. And then similar to what we see in general is that Blacks have the highest incidence rates in Colorado. I guess a little bit surprisingly, American Indian and Native Alaskans are lower, though that just may be because there's not a huge population of those patients in Colorado. And you can advance. All right, so looking more, this is actually Northwest Colorado data. And Andrea, feel free to chime in. I know this is your data, so if there's anything else you wanted to highlight, just let me know. But we can see there's a pretty big discrepancy in incidence rates between men and women. But if you then look at, and the incidence rate overall is lower than the Colorado average. But if you look at mortality, we can see that actually mortality is actually higher. And so what that says to me is that, and obviously the low incidence rate among men probably says that we're not catching cancer. I mean, the incidences are lower, probably just because we're not looking for it, meaning we're not screening as well in this part of Colorado as we are in other parts of Colorado, which is not surprising given the rural nature, given the patient makeup, things like that. We also know men are far less likely to be screened than women in general, and that's probably more true among certain patient populations. You can advance the slide. All right, so let's move on to talking about how we're doing with screening. So this is a popular graph to show and talks about colorectal cancer screening, and it shows the trend in both mortality and incidence of colon cancer over time. And it's really, good news. The incidence has been dropping pretty precipitously since kind of the late 80s. That arrow there points to 2000, which is when CMS started approving colonoscopy, as it started covering the colonoscopy as a screening test for colorectal cancer. And we can see the incidence pretty much started dropping precipitously there and has continued for the most part until recently. A lot of this decline that happened before we did a lot of screening was just in the reduction in modifiable risk factors. So a lot of fewer people smoking, things like that had a significant impact on incidence and mortality from colon cancer. But this is, I think, offers at least circumstantial evidence that probably screening has played a role as well. You can advance. And this is just another way of looking kind of at the same data. So comparing kind of inverse relationship between incidence of colorectal cancer and the uptake of colonoscopy and colon cancer screening over time. Again, more circumstantial evidence that screening for colon cancer has an impact on reducing incidence. Unfortunately, though, we know the kind of, and this, we'll look at a little bit later too, but that reduction in incidence is not borne out equally over all age groups. So while the vast majority of patients who get colorectal cancer are over the age of 65, and in those patients, the incidence rates have been declining. In younger patients, the incidence rate was either declining and now kind of backtracking, or in those younger than 50, the incidence rates and mortality are actually rising over the last 2 decades for colon cancer. In advance. So I think that kind of highlights the importance of screening and all the work we really need to continue to do both for all patients, but primarily often for younger patients as well. So this is kind of looking at, I think this is data from 2018, so it's a little bit old, but not a lot of progress has been made since then. So looking at all states across the country, you can see Colorado there sits around 70% for rate of the percent of patients who are up to date on screening for colon cancer by any method, which is pretty middle of the road in terms of the country as a whole. In advance. I wanted to highlight here the heat map that I think does a good job at pointing out the differences, though, between kind of rural and more urban communities in terms of screening rates across the country. So it's not surprising that places like the Northeast, which is a much more urban population, screening rates are higher, where places like Texas and the South, screening rates are lower. And this article actually points out that if you look at states that have better screening rates, have a lower, I guess, gap between urban and rural patients, whereas states that have lower screening rates have a much wider gap, meaning that patients in like Texas who live in rural communities, less than 50% of them or so are undergoing colon cancer screening. In Colorado, we're doing a little bit better. You can advance the slide. So this is looking at a breakdown by a county for Colorado as a whole. And yellow means people who are screening really well. Purple points to the counties that are not screening well. And then everything else kind of in between. Again, not surprising, you know, around Denver and the Front Range, doing a pretty good job. Way out east, you know, more kind of rural plains, not so much. And then kind of on the western slope, you kind of have a little bit of everything. You have, you know, counties like Pitkin and more wealthy communities, and then you have more rural places as well. Some of it also is dependent on the population size. Obviously, if you have a very small population, it doesn't take as much to get screening rates up. You can advance. And then this just kind of compares on a county level basis screening rates to Colorado as a whole. I think counties from the western slope are circled there in red, and we can see for the most part, they are at or below the kind of statewide average. You have to zoom in quite a bit there to see the specific counties. I think the point is not surprising in this stands that we have opportunities to improve the rate of screening for our patients who live in rural communities, and specifically on the western slope. You can advance in here. And then one more map here, kind of looking at three different variables. So looks at, if you look at the circle, the color indicates screening rates. So kind of mimicking one of the maps we saw beforehand. But then we compare that to poverty level, which we know impacts patients' ability to get insurance, as well as to have the time to go get screened, see doctors, things like that. And then the relationship to the diagnosis of late stage colon cancer. So if we look, I mean, somewhat ironically, places like Mesa County, we're actually doing a pretty good job at screening, as some of the has a lower, not surprisingly, I guess, a lower or a higher rate of late stage colorectal cancer diagnosis. Yeah, this map's always a little confusing, but so the dark maroon means that they have, you know, high rate of late stage colorectal cancer, but that light yellow circle suggests that they're doing a pretty good job at screening. So what that points to is there may be other factors like, you know, patient risk factors, things like that, that have led to a higher rate of late stage disease. You can advance. And we also know that poverty rates are higher out there as well. And then again, looking at just Northwest Colorado, so this somewhat mimics, yeah, you can stick with this slide, thanks. This somewhat mimics kind of the nation as a whole, as we talked about. Older patients, more likely to have Medicare public insurance, more likely to get screened. And then patients with health insurance, obviously more likely to get screened. Actually, interestingly, on the Northwest Colorado, that Hispanics have a significantly higher rate of undergoing screening. And then all the patients are rural, so not surprising. And in this survey, at least only 61% of all patients were getting screened, which is about 10% lower than the statewide average. You can advance. All right, so this is a little bit more of the kind of nitty gritty. You're going to delve into the data, but I did want to kind of highlight the new guidelines and then talk about why these changes were made. So in 2020, Multi-Society Task Force, which is just made up of the 3 different major GI societies, changed their surveillance recommendations after polypectomy and colonoscopy. And then probably more relevant to primary care doctors would be the United States Preventive Services Task Force change in 2021 to start recommending, at least as a grade B recommendation, that we start screening patients at age 45 and not 50. You can advance. All right, so this is from the 2020 updates to surveillance recommendations, and I'll just kind of point out to those of you who are primary care doctors, the main take-home point is just that the risk of 1 to 2 small precancerous polyps is now thought to be lower than what it used to be, and therefore GI doctors have leeway to basically bunch those patients into the same category of risk as patients who had no polyps. And so most doctors are probably still recommending 7 years, but it used to be 5 years, and they have the opportunity to recommend 10 years. And then we also tried to parse out, patients who just have who only have small adenomas still, but have 3 to 4, probably not as high risk as those who have really large precancerous polyps or adenomas, or who have a lot of precancerous polyps or adenomas. And so in general, the thought process is a few small precancerous polyps, probably not that big a deal, probably can space out their colonoscopy. No changes to the risk stratification for those patients who have advanced precancerous polyps. So those are polyps that are a centimeter or bigger, of specific histologic features like dysplasia, or in patients who have just a lot of polyps. That can be a sign of certainly a predisposition to developing cancer. You can advance. And then this chart, I think, does a good job of trying to capture why those recommendations were made. So if you look at their proportion of patients who have kind of the index finding of either no polyps, 1 to 2 small polyps, or a high risk polyp, meaning one of those ones I talked about, large or with dysplasia or something like that, the absolute risk of developing advanced neoplasia later in life. So advanced neoplasia would be another high risk adenoma or colorectal cancer. The absolute risk is pretty comparable for those who've had no polyps and those who have just 1 to 2 polyps. And so you're probably not giving the patient a whole lot of extra benefit by repeating colonoscopies relatively frequently in patients who've just had a few small adenomas. And those patients actually overall are probably at a lower risk, lifetime risk of developing colorectal cancer than, or at least comparable lifetime risk of developing colorectal cancer as those who are average risk. So that's all comers, right? You can advance. And then moving on to the other change in the guidelines in 2021. So this is just, the screening in adults age 45 to 49 does not receive as strong a recommendation as those in age 50 to 75. But prior to 2021, it wasn't really in the guidelines other than for Black sex. So there was a recommendation to consider screening Black patients starting at age 45. But now there's a grade B, which is a pretty strong recommendation to start screening all patients at age 45. Advance. And the reason behind that is just because of the change in incidence rates that we've seen over the last 3 to 4 decades. So the incidence rates of colon cancer in a 50-year-old in 1992 was actually significantly lower than the incidence rate of colorectal cancer in a 45 to 49-year-old now. And in 1992 is about when we started thinking about screening for colorectal cancer in patients around the age of 50. So if we thought back then that we should be screening 50-year-olds, well now, a 45-year-old has a higher risk of getting colon cancer now than a 50-year-old did back then. So why not start screening 45-year-olds now? And just to put a little bit more data on it, over the last 2 decades, since about the turn of the millennium, there's about a 1% increase annually in colorectal cancer incidence in patients under the age of 50. And if current projections hold, colon cancer will kill the most people. Colon cancer will kill more people under 50 by age of 230 than any other cancer. It's already doing it for men, but by 2030, it will be for all patients. You can advance. And I did want to talk about this birth cohort effect because that plays a pretty significant role. So we could, we know that overall incidence rates of colorectal cancer have been declining. That's primarily because incidence rates in older people are declining due to things like modifiable risk factor reduction as well as the uptake of screening. But the incidence rate of colorectal cancer in young people has been increasing. And if you look actually at the data, it seems to start in around 1960 that there was this switch and that patients before then, successive generations had a lower risk of colon cancer. But after 1960, successive generations started to have a much higher risk of colon and rectal cancer relative to the generations before them. So specifically, adults born in 1990 have a twofold increased risk of colon cancer and a fourfold increased risk of rectal cancer compared to the same adults born in 1950. So that is one of the other reasons why we start thinking about looking for colon cancer at a younger age, just because of this birth cohort effect. Okay, you can advance. All right, and then the last kind of bulk of things that I'm going to touch on tonight are just the various screening methods. These are the ones that are currently approved or listed as options by the United States Preventive Services Task Force. There are others, which I'll talk about a little bit, but these are the ones we probably usually go to, and the vast majority of us will use colonoscopy or stool-based tests. You can advance the slide. All right, so real quickly, simple question, what is the best test? The answer is simply the one that the patient will do. There actually is not good data comparing one test to the other. We are awaiting data out of an Italian group that was supposed to be published probably in the New England Journal this year. Still haven't seen it yet, may come soon. And then you may or may not know about the large VA confirmed study. They're still enrolling patients, and we're probably not going to have data from that for another 5 years. So that compares FIT to colonoscopy in the VA population. So maybe one day we will have data, but right now we don't. And so the honest answer to what the best test is the one that you can get your patient to do. The vast majority of colon cancers are diagnosed in people who are not screened at all. So screening does save lives. And if you can get your patient to do any of the screening tests, they'll have a better chance of not being diagnosed with colorectal cancer, or at least if they are diagnosed, being diagnosed at an early stage where they can be easily treated. You can advance. So this is some data that just looks at the performance characteristics. So this isn't kind of comparing one to the other in terms of real world use, but just so you have some understanding, looking at the sensitivity of the various tests. So colonoscopy, not surprising, high sensitivity for cancer, as well as both large advanced precancerous polyps and smaller precancerous polyps as well. Significantly outperforms all the other screening tests in terms of sensitivity, but much harder to get patients to do. It's invasive, requires anesthesia. You have to do nasty things like do a bowel prep, stuff like that. So if you look at the other tests, well, FIT every year, reasonable sensitivity, a little bit better than just fecal occult blood. Sensitivity obviously drops significantly when you're not talking about cancer, and that's true for pretty much all the other stool-based testing. CT colonography, we probably don't use that much, but pretty good sensitivity and for both cancer and advanced adenomas. And then I did want to highlight that FIT DNA, which we probably all refer to as Cologuard, has definitely better sensitivity than other stool-based testing for cancer and for precancerous polyps, though it's still not that great. And there's not a lot of data actually, and this sensitivity is reported FIT DNA used every year, where we all know that we use it every 3 years. You can advance. And so let's look, what's the data on its impact on colorectal cancer incidence mortality. So for FOBT, we have good data. We have randomized controlled data, showed a 20% incidence reduction and an 18% mortality reduction in colorectal cancer. For FIT testing, we only have observational data that shows similar incidence reduction, and observational data is always biased, so that you have to take that mortality reduction of near 60% with a grain of salt. For dual DNA FIT, which is Cologuard, there is no data on its reduction in incidence rates or mortality. And there's been modeling studies that have done that showed that FIT DNA actually is inferior to annual FIT, both in performance and cost. The truth of FIT DNA is, so it's basically FIT plus looking for multi-target stool DNA. But if you have access to the kind of trials, the granular data from the trials that got it FDA approved, you'll see that something like 98% of the time, it's the fit that's positive in Cologuard. And so the stool DNA does not add a whole lot in terms of its performance characteristics. The main benefit of Cologuard is that the company that makes it will do a lot of patient navigation to make sure that the patient actually completes the stool test. So they won't then, and they'll get that data back to the doctor, but they won't, and they'll tell the patient they need a colonoscopy if it's positive, but that's kind of where they end. FlexSig, there is RCT data, 22% reduction in incidence, 28% reduction in mortality. But interesting for FlexSig, if you look at just left-sided cancers, so that FlexSig obviously only looks at the left side of the colon, whereas colonoscopy looks at the whole colon, there was about a 50% reduction in mortality in that RCT data. And then colonoscopy, again, we only really have observational data. We'll talk about the Nordic trial here next, but observational data, again, biased, shows 70% incidence reduction, about 70% mortality reduction in colorectal cancer with colonoscopy. And you can advance the slide. All right, so I did want to talk a little bit about the Nordic study just because it got so much media attention. I think there's a few things to take away from this. You can advance. So number one, this, we need randomized controlled trial data on colonoscopy, and this to some extent provides that, but it's really about what's the invitation to get a colonoscopy, what's that impact on colorectal cancer. So only about 40% of the patients who were invited in the colonoscopy arm actually underwent a colonoscopy. And among those patients, there was a 20% incidence reduction. So I think that highlights two things, that even if you have a test where only 40% of the people do it, you still get about equivalent incidence reduction as stool-based testing. But it also points that colonoscopy is hard to get patients to do, and that may be its main limitation and why it's maybe not the best test, certainly not for all patients. You can advance the slide. The other thing I'll point out of the Nordic study is it just wasn't powered to detect a mortality difference. So they reported no difference in mortality, and that's not surprising because they powered the study to look for a difference at 15 years. But this study that was published last year in the New England Journal looked at data at 10 years. And so the overall incidence of, or the overall mortality rate for the usual care groups, so the patient who weren't invited to do colonoscopy, was very low because it takes a long time for colon cancer to form. So you wouldn't expect necessarily to see a mortality difference at 10 years. I think at 15 and in 20 years, you probably will see a significant mortality difference. If you just look at the graphs, you can see them start to separate, and they likely will continue to. So I would take the lack of mortality difference with a significant grain of salt. All right, and you can advance. Okay, finally, advance one more time. We'll talk about the new tests. Go back one. Yeah, perfect. New tests that are some of these are commercially available, but what's on the horizon and what we might all have to look forward to in the next decade or so. So you may have heard of blood-based testing to screen for not just colon cancer, but these multi-cancer. They're either methylated DNA or cell-free DNA plus protein blood tests. That MSEP9 test is a methylated DNA test specific to colorectal cancer. That's actually FDA approved. It's been available for a long time, but it's not part of the USPSTF guidelines, and so it's not really covered by insurance. Also, its performance characteristics are worse than FIT, so there's not a lot of reason to use it. There's all these other blood tests. Some of them are commercially available, obviously not covered by insurance. None of the other ones are FDA approved. There's these multi-omics tests, which actually look for methylated DNA plus the protein in the blood, and then you use machine learning or artificial intelligence to provide prediction as to what the patient's risk is of having colon cancer. And then more imaging-based tests. There's a colon capsule. We actually have that at our VA. They're just rolling out that. I haven't seen it yet, but we may be able to have a better idea of how well that works. The main downside of the colon capsule is that it requires a bowel prep. And then if you find something, you have to have the patient do a colonoscopy. And if you can't have them do a colonoscopy on the same day, they just have to do another bowel prep. So ideally, you have a patient do the colon capsule and be prepared to actually do a colonoscopy if you see a polyp that you want to go in and remove. There's actually a CT capsule, which is something the patient swallows, and it's a little basically X-ray device within the capsule that recreates a 3D mapping of the patient's colon that is meant to highlight polyps or tumors. And then finally, there's MR colonography, which is essentially CT colonography, but with MRI. Doesn't expose the patient to the radiation, but obviously has the downsides of MRI, which is some patients can't get it, and it takes longer than a CT scan. All right, I think the rest of the talk I'll leave to Andrea to talk about capacity building efforts on the Western Slope.
Okay, thank you so much. So this is fantastic. I think a really nice glimpse of general screening guidelines and what's to come. An awesome job with the data. I mentioned previous that part of the work that we're doing is really looking at building capacity in terms of particularly for the medically underserved with the federally qualified health systems, rural health systems, critical access hospitals, and also looking at opportunity for building opportunity for referral into endoscopy, screening colonoscopy, but also really looking at patients who are positive from stool-based testing and the FIT follow-up. So these are initiatives that we're working on, trying to look at providing more resources and technical assistance and support. So as we move forward, there will be another talk in January about providing the education and background as it relates to high-risk population, workups of signs and symptoms, and the kind of need to know for individuals who need follow-up colonoscopy and the like. But I think in the technical support and education, we'd also like to do is do some bridge building between our community primary care partners, as well as our screening and endoscopy partners on the Western Slope and even into the Front Range. So if you're interested in this work, and I think even joining again this evening, an interest in receiving a COPIC point, let me see if I can get to my next slide here. Please feel free to email me directly at andrea.dwyer@ucdenver.edu. We have our Anschutz email address as well, but I still use UC Denver because it's easier just for people to identify and to email. So please go ahead and give us a shout out if you have any questions for Dr. Jones or are interested in working with us in this initiative for targeted approach on the Western Slope as well. So Wesley's put my contact information in the chat, and we will make sure that we do, both of you who have attended this evening, and I think others that have registered and will be utilizing and watching the recording, all the information is provided to COPIC in terms of reimbursement, or not reimbursement, but award of the point, I should say. And with that, I would just see if there's any specific questions for Blake or myself or our team before we close this evening. And thank you, Katie and Katie, Dr. Rose and Dr. Richmond. Really appreciate both being here this evening. Any other questions before we close tonight or thoughts? Are we good?
What do you
Okay.
think is the primary care people that do colonoscopy? Oh, she gone.
No, I can answer that. I mean, I think that in general, we need more capacity to do colonoscopy for patients who need it. And so if you're well trained, and able to meet the standard kind of quality metrics for performing colonoscopy and removing polyps, then I would welcome anyone to do it. Because there's probably not enough GI doctors to meet the demand for all the patients who need colorectal cancer screening. I mean, I think that would point to the benefits of non-colonoscopy based cancer screening, because we probably, even if I have a bunch of primary care doctors doing colonoscopy, cannot meet the demand for all patients. I think the important thing is just that colonoscopy as a test is very user dependent, and so if you do it, you just have to make sure that you're measuring things like your adenoma detection rate and your fecal intubation rate, making sure you're doing high quality exams. And if you're doing that, then there's no reason not to do it.
Because most times in rural areas, it's general surgery or primary care that's doing it, because gastroenterology is an hour to 2 hours away.
Yeah, like I said, I think that's perfectly reasonable if the provider feels comfortable with their own abilities.
Okay.
Okay, any other thoughts before we close for tonight? And I think we said finishing at 6:15 and you did 6:08, Blake, so well done, well done.
All right, yeah, I thought you would take a little bit more time. I could have added a little bit more, but that's fine.
Yeah, that's great. All right, everybody. And again, we're really looking forward to continuing the work with Delta and team. And again, we'll make sure that COPIC is alerted for the participation tonight. And thank you guys so much for your attendance and super appreciate all of the great work. So thank you all. Have a good evening. And thank you, Blake, for your expertise and time this evening. Have a good night, everybody.
Invite.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.